This wasn't something new. It had actually started even before Heranthi's stepfather got married to her mother. But now, it was happening more frequently. Back then, Mr. Therindu had begun asking for Heranthi to serve him instead of her mother. It didn't take long after her mother's passing for things to escalate. Therindu made it clear that if Heranthi refused to comply, she'd be kicked out of the house. Fearful of losing her home and with nowhere else to go, Heranthi felt trapped. 4 years, she had no choice but to endure and follow her stepfather's demands, living under his constant threats. Hey there, and welcome to our channel. Today, we're bringing you another jaw-dropping and real story from across the globe. This time, we're heading to Vavuniya town, nestled in the northern province of Sri Lanka, to uncover a heart-wrenching tale. Our story shines a light on a woman caught in an unimaginable nightmare, forced to serve her father, her older stepbrother, and her younger stepbrother, all for the sake of her husband. What's the full story behind this tragic ordeal? Stick with us as we dive deep into this shocking and unsettling case. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel. And hey, share this story with your friends. It deserves to be heard far and wide. So, here's how the story unfolds. Meet Heranthi. Born in 1995, she was raised by her widowed mother and grew up as an only child. In 2011, her mother remarried a police officer named Therindu. But life took a heartbreaking turn in 2016 when her mother passed away due to an illness, leaving Heranthi to live with her stepfather, her older stepbrother Asanka, and her younger half-brother Lalith. Asanka worked as a bodyguard for a local council member, while Lalith was still in high school. Heranthi, on the other hand, was a quiet and reserved person with few friends. However, there was one person she held close, a friend named Upal. Upal had previously worked in construction, but thanks to Heranthi, he found a new job at her workplace when an opportunity opened up. Upal had a somewhat feminine demeanor, which eased her stepfather's concerns about their friendship. Despite this, Therindu sometimes felt uneasy when they spent time together behind closed doors. Heranthi reassured him there was nothing romantic going on, even claiming that Upal wasn't into girls. Still, Therindu couldn't help but notice something unusual in Upal's behavior. His gestures, like stroking Heranthi's hair, felt a little too intimate for just friends. Perhaps it was harmless, or maybe there was more beneath the surface. Then came January 2017. Out of nowhere, Heranthi announced she was in a relationship with a man named Naimal. The news took everyone by surprise, especially Upal. He seemed deeply affected, acting cold and distant toward Heranthi. For weeks, he avoided her, clearly upset. This left Heranthi confused and hurt, as she had always considered Upal her closest friend, almost like a brother. Heranthi confided in her father about how Upal had been avoiding her. Her father, never one to mince words, said bluntly, "He likes you. Even if he seems feminine, he's still a man. You're just too innocent to see it. Spending so much time with him, practically glued together, and you didn't suspect anything? That's why I told you not to get too close to Upal." It took a while for Heranthi to process her father's words. Meanwhile, Upal quit his job and disappeared. About a month later, Heranthi finally mustered the courage to visit his rental house to confront him. When they met, Upal was visibly upset and didn't hold back. He confessed that he had liked and loved Heranthi all along, believing their closeness meant they were practically dating. Her sudden relationship with Naimal had crushed him. Heranthi apologized profusely and tried to salvage their friendship, but Upal refused. He decided it was best to keep his distance. It was a tough decision for both, but life went on. Heranthi's relationship with Naimal only grew stronger. They tied the knot in May 2018 when Heranthi was 23 and Naimal was 25. The wedding took place in Naimal's hometown of Amavatan, but the couple returned to Vavuniya city shortly after, as both worked in the area. Naimal worked as a building supervisor, essentially a foreman, and despite his young age, he excelled at his job. Heranthi was incredibly proud of him. However, in August 2019, their happiness took a heartbreaking turn. Hiranthy became pregnant, but due to complications with her uterus, she miscarried. The loss was devastating for the couple, who had been eagerly hoping for a child. Then, in December 2019, tragedy struck again. While overseeing construction work, Naimal was involved in a severe accident. 3 workers lost their lives, and Naimal was hospitalized with critical injuries. He survived, but one of his legs was paralyzed, and his lower back sustained significant damage, requiring intensive care. Initially, Naimal stayed in the hospital, but as costs mounted, much of his treatment was moved home. His workplace supported him financially for 6 months, continuing to pay his salary despite his inability to work. But after that, they cut ties, leaving Hiranthy as the sole breadwinner while also caring for her husband. To manage both her responsibilities and reduce living costs, Hiranthy made the difficult decision to move back into her father's house. There, they had the help of a household assistant to look after Naimal while she worked. It wasn't ideal. Naimal longed for his wife to be by his side throughout his recovery, but it was the only option they had to make ends meet. In June 2020, amidst the challenges of the pandemic, Hiranthy was overjoyed to share some good news. She was pregnant again. Despite Naimal being bedridden and unable to walk, the news brought him immense happiness. Even his doctor noticed a marked improvement in Naimal's health after hearing about the pregnancy. The family clung to this ray of hope, eagerly awaiting the baby's arrival. But in August 2020, everything took a turn for the worse. Hiranthy began experiencing severe abdominal pain and rushed to the hospital. She had been careful, avoiding strenuous activity and strictly following her doctor's advice on nutrition and precautions. Despite her efforts, the pregnancy wasn't progressing. The devastating news came when the doctor informed her that the fetus was no longer viable and recommended a minor procedure to prevent any health complications. Hiranthy was crushed but chose not to tell Naimal, fearing it would worsen his fragile condition. Instead, she confided only in her father and stepbrother Asanka, while pretending to Naimal that everything was fine. This secrecy became an opportunity for Asanka to exploit her vulnerability. Divorced and living under the same roof, he began making inappropriate advances, often cornering Hiranthy in the kitchen or other secluded areas of the house. When she resisted, Asanka threatened to tell Naimal about the miscarriage, knowing it would emotionally devastate him. Terrified, Hiranthy felt forced to comply. She reasoned bitterly that they weren't blood relatives, trying to rationalize her helplessness. But Asanka's motives went further. He aimed to impregnate Hiranthy, believing that giving Naimal a child would mend the family's turmoil. Meanwhile, another shadow loomed over Hiranthy's life. Her stepfather, Mr. Thirindu, had been crossing boundaries long before her marriage. After Hiranthy's mother passed away, he began making inappropriate demands under the guise of needing her care. His behavior escalated over the years, with threats to throw her out of the house if she didn't comply. Now, his advances became even more frequent, adding to the unrelenting pressure on Hiranthy. Trapped in a suffocating web of manipulation and abuse, Hiranthy endured in silence, her world growing darker with each passing day. The situation only grew worse. Mr. Thirindu didn't hold back his threats, warning Hiranthy that if she refused his advances, he would not only kick her out of the house but also her bedridden husband, Naimal. Trapped by fear and concern for her husband, Hiranthy felt she had no choice but to comply. But her struggles didn't stop there. Her half-brother Lalith, who was still in high school, had stumbled upon the horrific acts involving Hiranthy, her stepfather, and her stepbrother Asanka. Instead of helping or reporting the abuse to authorities, Lalith secretly recorded the incidents on his phone. He then used these videos to blackmail Hiranthy, demanding the same privileges his father and brother had been taking from her. Terrified that Lalith would show the videos to Naimal and fearing that it might worsen her husband's fragile condition, Hiranthy begged him to keep it a secret. But Lalith was relentless. Left with no other option, she gave in to his demands. From that point on, Hiranthy endured daily abuse from all 3 men, each taking their turn at different times. Whether they knew of each other's actions or not, one thing was clear: they never acted together, but they all inflicted their cruelty on her. Hiranthy bore it all in silence, her patience stretched beyond human limits. She had thought about taking Nimal back to his hometown in Amavaton, hoping they could escape the nightmare. However, the pandemic made traveling nearly impossible, and her in-laws were also struggling financially, unable to support even themselves. "Just stay there. We can't afford to feed you here," they had told her. With no other options, Hiranthi stayed, continuing to care for her husband while enduring the horrors inflicted upon her in her stepfather's home. The suffocating cycle of abuse and helplessness seemed unending. After months of suspicion, Nimal finally confronted Hiranthi about her pregnancy. He noticed her stomach wasn't growing and asked what was going on. By this point, his health hadn't improved, and he was still bedridden. Unable to keep up the charade any longer, Hiranthi admitted the heartbreaking truth. She had miscarried again. Nimal was devastated, but what Hiranthi didn't expect was the reaction from her stepfather, Mr. Thirindu. Tired of having Nimal around, he viewed his paralyzed son-in-law as a burden, someone who contributed nothing while consuming resources. Hiranthi's overtime pay was barely enough to cover Nimal's treatments, leaving little for the household. Thirindu started pushing the idea of divorce, claiming it would ease everyone's troubles. But for Hiranthi, leaving Nimal wasn't an option. She loved him deeply, and despite everything, she remained committed to his recovery. Still, her desperate situation forced her to make unimaginable sacrifices. To keep Nimal from being kicked out and ensure they had food, Hiranthi continued to endure the predatory demands of her stepfather, stepbrother Asanka, and half-brother Lalith. Exhausted from working long hours and facing daily abuse, she soldiered on for Nimal's sake. To cut costs, they even dismissed their household assistant, adding more to Hiranthi's already overwhelming responsibilities. As months turned into years, the cycle of torment continued. Then, in March 2022, Hiranthi's world crumbled further. She was laid off from her job when her company downsized due to declining profits. With no income, the weight of her struggles became unbearable. Desperate for help, she reached out to her old friend Upal through social media. Now working as a tour guide in Vavyania, a popular tourist destination, Upal listened as Hiranthi poured her heart out. She told him everything, about her failing marriage, the cruel treatment she endured at the hands of her stepfamily, and the hopelessness of her situation. Upal was horrified by her story and urged her to report the abuse to the authorities. But Hiranthi hesitated. Living under the same roof as her abusers and relying on her stepfather for Nimal's therapy bills made the idea of going to the police feel impossible. Still, Upal couldn't accept her decision. "This isn't normal, Hiranthi," he insisted. "How long will you let them use you like this? Your stepfather and stepbrother should be protecting you, not taking advantage of you. This needs to stop." Hiranthi, however, wasn't ready to take that step, trapped by fear and the weight of her circumstances. One afternoon in early May 2022, Upal decided to visit Hiranthi and Nimal at their home. Asanka, who was off work that day, was also there. The sight of him made Upal uneasy. His emotions were simmering, but he held back, knowing he couldn't afford to act impulsively while Hiranthi's father and younger brother were away. They sat in the living room, making small talk, though the atmosphere was tense. Upal's feelings were mixed, perhaps lingering resentment toward Nimal for stealing Hiranthi, or more likely, anger toward Asanka, knowing the horrors he'd subjected her to. At one point, Hiranthi excused herself to use the bathroom. Moments later, Asanka got up and followed her, raising Upal's suspicions. Claiming he needed the toilet too, Upal followed closely behind. What he saw next shocked him. Asanka forced his way into the bathroom where Hiranthi was, locking the door behind him. Enraged, Upal shouted, "Hey! That's your own sister. What the hell are you doing?" Asanka barked back, and the confrontation escalated. Tempers flared, and soon punches were flying. Despite his strong build, Upal found himself matched by Asanka's aggression. Hiranthi tried desperately to intervene, screaming for them to stop, but the fight only grew more chaotic. At one point, Asanka grabbed a non-stick pan from the kitchen and swung it at Upal, who retaliated with equal force. In the commotion, Nimal struggled to get up from the couch, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but his movements were too slow to make a difference. Meanwhile, Asanka ran to his room, and Upal, consumed by anger, chased after him. What Upal didn't anticipate, or perhaps momentarily forgot, was that Asanka, a bodyguard by profession, kept a firearm. In a moment of fury, Asanka fired several shots. The gunfire echoed through the house, and Upal collapsed, lifeless. Hiranthi and Naimal screamed in horror as neighbors rushed over, alarmed by the noise. Asanka tried to escape through the back door, but residents who had gathered outside quickly caught him and handed him over to the police. During the police interrogation, the truth finally came out. Hiranthi, with tears streaming down her face, confessed everything, not just to the investigators but also to Naimal. She revealed the abuse and torment she had endured for the past 2 years at the hands of her stepfather, Asanka, and Lalith. She admitted that it all began when she tried to hide her miscarriage from Naimal, fearing it would worsen his fragile condition. From there, the threats, blackmail, and coercion spiraled out of control. Hiranthi explained how she endured it all, not out of willingness, but desperation. She felt trapped, knowing their survival depended on her compliance. They needed food, money, and care for Naimal, and she couldn't see another way. Hearing this, Naimal broke down, overwhelmed with guilt and despair. He blamed himself for being unable to protect her, for being too dependent, and for the pain she had to endure just to keep their lives afloat. It was a moment of heartbreaking truth, leaving both of them shattered. Hiranthi's lawyer worked tirelessly to bring her stepfather, brother, and half-brother to justice. A post-mortem examination and a detailed investigation were conducted, uncovering the extent of the abuse she endured. Surprisingly, the former household assistant, who had been dismissed earlier, came forward as a key witness. She testified about the inappropriate behavior she had observed from both Thirindu and Asanka toward Hiranthi during her employment. The trial also included the case against Asanka for the fatal confrontation with Upal. Unsurprisingly, Asanka denied all allegations, claiming that Upal attacked him first without reason. However, the judge dismissed this defense, citing multiple witnesses who testified to Upal's good character. Known for being kind and law-abiding, it was highly unlikely that Upal would initiate an attack unprovoked. The contents of Hiranthi's messages with Upal were also presented as evidence, further corroborating her claims of the abuse she suffered at the hands of her stepfamily. In October 2022, the Vavuniya City High Court delivered its verdict. The judge declared Asanka guilty of deliberately taking Upal's life, firing multiple bullets during their altercation. Additionally, he was charged with the felony of misconduct toward his sister, Hiranthi. At 33 years old, Asanka was sentenced to life in prison. Mr. Thirindu was also found guilty of years of inappropriate behavior toward his stepdaughter and received a 10-year prison sentence. As for Lalith, the court acknowledged his involvement but, due to his status as a minor, he was sentenced to mandatory reporting and rehabilitation instead of imprisonment. Justice, though delayed, was finally served. For Hiranthi, the verdict marked the beginning of a long journey toward healing and reclaiming her life. What lessons can we take from this story?